our new community wildfire protection plans relevant and something that we can all not only live with, but something we can live by. We're going to bring it down to the more local level to talk truly about our community here. Invite these guys to jump up on the hot seats, if you will. And so first here on our left side is Julie Baxter, who is our Director of Water, Water Resources Manager for the City of Steamboat Springs. Christy Windsor, who is the Planning Director for Routt County, and Todd Carr, who is the Chief Building Official for Routt County. We're going to talk a little bit about how our local policies, rules, and regulations really tie into wildfire protection, mitigating that risk locally, and then again, we'll have some questions afterwards. So as they are speaking, if you do have questions, write those down on your note cards and or be ready to jump up and ask a question when we're done. We'll turn over to Julie first.
Great, thanks. Julie Baxter, City of Steamboat Springs Water Resources Manager. I have a background in long range and land use planning, and so we're going to jump into plans and policies. I do have some slides, so does Christy, because we need to, plans and policies. I know it sounds kind of boring. We're not the fire expert, but I'm going to give you kind of an overview of why this is so important. And then we're also going to talk about the policies and plans that we have in place on the local level and our recommendations for moving forward. So we have spent time learning about our natural environment and our forests. And now we're going to talk about our built environment. And so this is sort of an old diagram that comes from actually the earthquake planning community, but it works well, I think, for any hazards. And so risk, our potential for disaster, it's that intersection between our natural environment and our built environment, between our wildfire hazard and our community assets. We like to call it the WUI often in the wildfire planning community. And thanks. In our natural environment, we have only so much control, right? We can do these landscape level treatments, but our fires are getting more severe. We have limited control there. We have lots of control over our built environment. And most of that control is at the local level, especially in Colorado. So while we have statewide wildfire hazard maps, we don't have standards for development in the WUI statewide. So those decisions get made at the local level. Hence your panel of local government experts here. And so the three of us were actually on the Plans and Policy Committee as part of the Routt County Wildfire Mitigation Council. And that committee, we lead two objectives for the council. One is updating the community wildfire protection plan, or helping to coordinate that update, I should say, as well as promoting wildfire plans and policies and codes and standards at the local level as well. And so the focus here is on a regulatory approach. So not quite as popular as some other education and other types of approaches, but where we build and how we build is really the most effective long-term mitigation we can do in our communities. So I'm going to give you just a quick overview. And we say plans and policies, like what are we talking about? So we're talking about our community's long-range plans, and this includes our hazard mitigation plans, our community wildfire protection plans. But really the most powerful plans are our land use plans, so our comprehensive and master plans, because they set the vision and the goals and the objectives and policies for how we develop and build our communities. And so in your long range plan, you can have policies and goals related to reducing risk in wildfire hazard areas, minimizing development there. Our long range plans are implemented through our codes and standards. Through our zoning code, which many of you are familiar with the zoning code. Zoning codes can include an adopted wildland or urban interface map, or they can include a wildfire hazard overlay zone where we can apply stronger standards in certain areas that have been determined to be at higher risk. Subdivision regulations you probably heard of, but maybe are less familiar. These govern how we divide land into parcels to be sold off. And so this can be a simple lot split. It could also be taking a ranch and turning that into a neighborhood, that kind of large level subdivision. And these, through the subdivision process, that's how we set rules for roads, access, open space, water supply, infrastructure. And so these are places where we can require like clustering of structures away from the most hazardous areas of a parcel. We can require HOAs to build and maintain defensible space, signage, things like that. We can require a fire protection plan as part of a subdivision approval. And then site development is the individual sites, where it could be new development, it can be redevelopment, and that's where we can do things like requiring defensible space, standards or access, certain standards for access at the individual site level. And then development review process is the process where the local government and the local departments approve that development. And through the development review process, we can have specific criteria for approval that's related to the wildfire hazard. Some communities have a wildfire mitigation specialist that would do specific site assessments as part of approvals for development in high hazard areas or subdivision in high hazard areas. And then lastly, we have building codes. I'm just going to let Todd get into that. And in many ways, they are probably can be our most effective tool. So we know that policies and codes are very effective at long-term risk reduction, but they are also very difficult to adopt, and they are difficult to enforce as well. And so there's a few questions that I want you all to be thinking about as we talk about what we do have in place moving forward. So one of the first questions here, and so the scale on top is showing you the things that are easier to get past versus the types of standards that are less popular often with the public and the community. So one of the first decisions would be, what type of standards do we think would be most effective for our risks and for our community? Defensible space is often one of the kind of more acceptable, kind of lower hanging fruit to get past, because it's less expensive and it can address existing development. It's also very hard to enforce. Kind of less popular, harder to get past standards are the more expensive ones, like fire-resistant building materials. Another key question is, when would you apply these standards? Would you apply them only to new development? That's sort of the easiest. You can also apply them to redevelopment, so a substantial, like over 50% of a value. You could apply standards. Applying them to existing development is often the hardest, most controversial. And then lastly, where are we apply standards? Would you apply them? Would you do a wildfire hazard adopted WUI map and only apply in those areas? Or would you apply it community-wide? A few years ago, I would probably say you definitely would use a hazard map. Now that it's not that black and white anymore, and community-wide standards may make more sense. So those are some key questions to be thinking about as we start talking about this type of standards that would be appropriate here. So it's only going to take me a minute to describe the type of standards that we have in place in the city of Steamboat Springs right now. So our comprehensive plan that we use right now is the Steamboat Springs Area Community Plan. It's a partnership with the county. It includes the city boundaries and also our urban growth boundary. Although the vision of that plan does speak to constrained areas where we may want to, it's very soft the way it's worded. So we may want to prevent certain development in constrained areas. It includes wildfire hazards on the list, but it does not take it any further in the plan. There are no policies or goals related to wildfire hazards in our existing community area plan. There is for floodplains, there is for geologic hazard areas, but not for wildfire. Now in our community, so you can imagine that if it's not in the comprehensive plan, it's probably not in our codes and standards. We do not have any development standards that address wildfire hazard areas in our community development code right now. And in the subdivision code, it does require it does say that some environmentally sensitive areas are not suitable for development. And it talks about wetlands and slopes over 30%. It does not talk about wildfire. And then our development review process as well, there's a criteria for approval that says that certain areas may need to limit the development potential. And wildfire is listed among many other constraints. But again, there's actually no additional detail. There's no criteria for that or additional performance criteria. So our takeaway here is that really in the city of Steamboat Springs, we have not integrated wildfire mitigation concepts into our long-range plans and codes at this point. But one great thing that we have done that was mentioned earlier is the Fish Creek Critical Watershed Wildfire Protection Plan. I think I got that. And so this was developed in partnership between the city and Mount Warner Water, as well as many other partners and collaborators. It is to protect our water supply in the event of a wildfire. So 90% of the city's water supply, drinking water supply, comes from the Fish Creek Basin, the Fish Creek Watershed. And so a fire in the watershed would be devastating to our reservoirs and potentially our to treat our water. And so this plan not only identifies activities that we can take in terms of fuels reduction and some forest treatment, but also identifies actions that the city can take to make improvements to our infrastructure, our water treatment plant, as well as plan for redundant water supplies as well. So I'm just going to sum up with some recommendations back on the land use side of things. I think we will be updating the area community plan. So I said 2004, it is definitely time for an update. That's on the list in the near future. So that's an opportunity to better integrate wildfire goals and policies. That we use the upcoming update to the Community Wildfire Protection Plan to build education about the types of policies that we don't have and we could have, understand the different support levels for those in the community, build some trust. I think we'll have to make some tough decisions about whether a community-wide standards make sense, or if it just applies to certain high hazard areas. We can also adopt standards that just to apply to certain uses. So certain very high hazard uses, like maybe gas stations or lumber yards, or that apply to critical facilities or facilities with vulnerable populations like our hospitals and our schools. So we can apply standards by use as well. And we can look at beginning to offer some rebates for people to make improvements on their properties. Because really we find that the most popular regulations are voluntary ones. So I'm going to turn it over to Chrissy to talk about some of the code. Hopefully she's going to have a lot more to say than I did on the codes at the county level.
Are you going to here or is this here? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm Christy Windsor. I am the Routt County Planning Director. While Julie went over why the three of us are here talking to you today, more in detail, I'm going to talk about what the county is doing in relation to a great land management tool that we use when we review land use applications. And where is the... see it. Oh. The one right in front of my face. Awesome. All right. So I get the question all the time, what do you do? And so that's a little complicated, but what I usually tell people is that I manage, and my planning staff, we manage the built and the natural environment, and we use land management tools to help guide us in doing that. Specifically, we use the umbrella plan, the master plan for the county. There are sub-area plans that fall under that master plan. As Julie mentioned, there is a joint plan that the city and the county are intending to update, which is the Steamboat Springs Area Community Plan. We also have recently adopted plans, which is the Hazard Mitigation Plan. And then we also have another jointly adopted plan, the Climate Action Plan, as well as the acronym there is for the Routt County Zoning Regulations and Subdivision Regulations. So collectively, those are the tools that we use to help balance the two, the built and the natural environment. So speaking about the master plan, our master plan was adopted in 2003. It is quite old, and we are currently in the process of updating that plan for several reasons. You want a plan that accurately represents the community's vision. We are growing, as we all know, and there is a lot of challenges that we face today and issues that we weren't really considering over almost 20 years ago. So with that, we are 9 months into the update of our master plan process. We're getting great information, but as it relates to why we're all here, currently, we do have policies within our master plan. They're rather broad that we use. And then in the zoning regulations, we do have standards, and they're mainly centered around reducing wildfire risk. So when we get the land use application, we refer to our zoning regulations and we use the master plan to help write our staff reports and give recommendations to the decision makers so they can make informed decisions. So as we have been going through this process, of updating our master plan, what you see up here is probably no surprise to anybody, but these are the challenges that we're facing and what we have heard from the community and how we have to try to manage those impacts from a growing population. And one of the biggest challenges we do have is, we do have a very strong existing master plan. And when you look out into the valley, the South Valley floor, and you see these wide open spaces, know that that was intentional. And that is something that we have heard loud and clear from the community, that they want to continue to maintain what we all love about Routt County. So at this point, this is an opportunity, a tremendous opportunity to go through this master plan update process through implementation strategies. Julie covered some of them, partnerships with the city and the county, but overall partnerships with our land managers. I think we all have experienced everybody in their own agencies, being siloed, and, we're starting to see people starting to work and collaborating better, knowing how important that actually is. We also need to, as Julie mentioned at the city too, we don't really have strong design standards. And that's where the real fun work begins, because after the master plan is adopted, which is slated for August of this year, the next step in the process is updating our regulations. And that's where the master plan and what we heard from the community, that's where it gets implemented. And that is something that we have been hearing. And that's where we'll be working closely with Todd and a lot of our community partners on, what those design standards will look like. We have heard loud and clear, as I mentioned, maintain growth and development to our growth centers. That is the foundation, the very foundation of our existing master plan. And at this point, that is not changing. We have heard loudly from the community that that is working for us. And that is recommending and directing our growth and development to municipalities of Routt County. So Steamboat, Hayden, Yampa, Oak Creek, and Stagecoach is continuing to be a potential growth area, which is in our existing master plan. But those places are where we have the infrastructure in place to support a growing population. So along with that, and most importantly, is support and integrate the goals of existing plans that recently have been adopted, but also that are in the works. So one of the goals would be that we can continue to leverage, future processes, and like the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. We can provide the information that we have learned through the update of the master plan to inform these other plans. So at this point, and on the bottom there, if anybody has not had an opportunity to go to the Navigate Your Routt website, it has a lot of great information. Staff put together a land use story map for Routt County. It's really fascinating. There's great graphs and interactive graphs and maps and information in there. And we're going to continue to have that updated and incorporated into the master plan when it is finalized. So putting it over to Todd. Oh, is yours separate?
Yeah, you
Okay. I see what you're doing. All right. Would you like me to stand here for you?
Remember, be thinking about your questions. Transferring their knowledge here. You guys write down your questions. And also, we're going to go to a break after we're done here, but we want you, and if you just need distraction, please take a moment to look at the posters and the maps. If those are things we want to be curious about as we go into this afternoon's later conversations. Tom, I'll turn it back to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Todd Carr, Routt County Building Official. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate everyone's participation this afternoon. And I want to give a big applause and thanks to Todd over here. I love working with this guy and most certainly enjoy him as our host this afternoon as well. So thank you. So as the building department and building official, we serve the entire county, which is somewhat rare for county building departments these days, but we're proud of that. We're excited to be able to serve our entire county and all the communities, including our towns, the city, and of course, unincorporated Routt County. So currently, we adopt building codes, right, countywide, and we do a great job, and we're able to work effectively with our elected officials, towns, cities, and unincorporated Routt County to keep a consistent adopted building code, almost identical throughout each of these jurisdictions. Why is that important? Well, it's important for professionals, design professionals, number one, working throughout the county, and most certainly our contractors as well. And of course, our homeowners. So I think it's easier if you can try to align those building codes across the 5 jurisdictions that we serve to keep that consistency approach going. Currently, I don't know if many of you know what the building department actually does. Of course, we're the pain in your rear where you have to come get a permit for your project, right? And pay some fees and whatnot. But what we do is protect you, right? We're looking out for your safety, both structurally, integrity of this structure, fire safety, energy codes, which affect our climate, right? As an example, like here in this room where we're at, you got exit signs here and here, right? We're all sitting in what's called an assembly occupancy space, and these walls are rated, right, for fires. So fire doesn't spread from outside in here or vice versa, starts in here and gets up. As you can see, we got 2 ways out of this room. That means there's an occupant load over 49 in this room, I can tell you that. Okay. So currently we adopt codes through ICC. I don't know how many people are familiar with what that means. That's the International Code Council, right? The interesting thing is ICC's been publishing a WUI code for years, right? The International Wildland Urban Interface Code is what it's called these days. The 2021 edition, if we were interested in adopting some wildland mitigation building codes, would probably be the code edition that we would go towards and drive into some policy and regulation, right? It's not, so building codes can be intimidating, right? Because it can be a financial burden for all of us as homeowners, builders, designers, commercial residential properties. But the interesting thing is a lot of these suggestions or codes that lie in the WUI code can be financially easy to move in that direction. And as far as like a lot of it could be more like labor, not as much material, right? It just depends how far we take it. But I was going to give you some examples today. So it starts by, the other thing I want to make clear is like normally we work with the fire folks, right? Fire department specifically, they have an ICC adopted fire code, it lies in the building codes. We do partner with other departments that perform reviews, but when it comes to buildings and structures, it's typically just the building and fire department that are looking out for the safety of yourself as you're in a building, right? Where the WUI code will go across community development departments, which is quite interesting, right? And what's nice is we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? So we have experts through ICC that publish these codes. And remember, ICC has been publishing codes for years, and before that it was the Uniform Building Codes, but they also work with the federal government, right? So many of you may not know this, but FEMA, right? Or after destruction of hurricanes, earthquakes, now wildfires that we're going into, right? Tsunamis. ICC works with the federal government to set a standard, right, of protection against natural occurrences like this, right? So you might not realize it, but in Routt County, your buildings are built to sustain 115 mile an hour wind, right? We also have seismic zones in Routt County, believe it or not, which kind of got updated in our last flip cycle. So most of us are in a seismic category B, some of us are in C. That's to protect against earthquakes. So with wildfires, what you're doing is the building codes have always, in fire codes, protected from building to building outside. So there's a term we use is FSD, it's called fire safe distance, right? So if this building is within the commercial, so commercial and residential buildings differ. For residential homes, we're wanting a 10-foot buffer between one home to the other. So each home really has 5-foot setback from the property line to the building exterior wall, right? And that keeps the home here in the A position safe if B starts on fire, right? So we have a little buffer. In commercial buildings, it gets different, but fire safe distance has been used for years to protect building to building from one fire spreading to another. So with wildfires, right, it's similar approach in WUI, except now we're thinking of Mother Nature, right? So we're thinking like we would have designed according to winds, hurricanes, or tornadoes, but we're fighting a fire that's coming at us from Mother Nature. So the WUI code sets distances like that. When you were talking about defensible space, vegetation, things around your home, propane tanks, Doug and the fire crew are constantly like giving advice about where people store wood, right? Sure, it's easy to store a bunch of wood on your porch, right? Because you can go out and grab it, but probably not a great idea, right? Does that make sense? So the WUI code is going to look out for things outside of your building to create a defensible space, or what I refer to as like a fire safe distance, in essence, as a wildfire approaches your home, right? So that's the number one thing with WUI. And what it would be based off is a risk factor map, right? Which a lot of these folks are talking about today, CWP plan. Our current RFP that's out is going to try to produce new mapping, right? So typically a WUI code will go in levels of risk. So yes, by that research developed and creating these maps, you would probably create 3 hazard areas, right? And these building codes would be applied based on where does your property lie and those risk factors of the map that's created. Once you create that map, then you're going to be working off creating defensible space again, based on risk. Fire department, all emergency services, sheriff, those are the folks that got to respond to you or get you out of your house a lot of times, right? In the middle of a wildfire, or get notifications. So just like I talked about, in a single room here, you got 2 exits. Well, if you live out in the middle of nowhere in a wooded forest, how do you get in and out of your property, right? Is your driveway safe? Also, right? Is there a defensible space for first responders and women and men that might come to your house in the middle of a wildfire? Is there room for you to get out that driveway if a wildfire is approaching, right? So defensible space isn't just to protect your building, but you got to think about it. How do I get out of my building, get away from it? We'll get you out of your building today, but the building code would just say 50 feet away and you're in safe haven space. But as the wildfire is approaching, you need to get away from your property, right? So it's like taking the defensible space concept and applying it all the way out your driveway or your lane until you get to a public road, right? Does that make sense? We have, let's see. Fire protection plans, I think, is kind of what we're talking about, what potentially in the future our planning and zoning departments and fire departments would request as part of a WUI code, right? And there's standards set by ICC of what those look like. And what these folks would expect to look at on a site plan really is what it would be, an exterior site plan. How are you creating that defensible space, both around your structure and maybe down the driveway out to the public way. And then we get into, so once we leave the exterior of the home, from a building codes perspective, I think the biggest thing that we talk about today, because we don't have any wildfire codes, Doug and I have talked about this a lot, is we still allow, believe it or not, wood shade growths, right? I mean, that seems ridiculous that we do, but we haven't ever pushed the regulation to not allow it. So like one simple step we could say is just like, we're gonna ban wood shade growths, right? It's really ridiculous that we allow it. Now, we don't see a lot, I'm gonna be honest, but still just the fact that they still could exist here doesn't make much sense. So roofing materials go, and a lot of exterior materials are rated by classes. So there's class A, B, and C in building codes. A being the most stringent. It's definitely not non-combustible, but what it means is it carries a certain flame spread, right? It's not going to ignite, so the ignition level is lighter than a class C. So like asphalt shingles are class A, just to give you an example of that sense, okay? So building codes could look at the exterior envelope of a structure through a WUI code and apply it based on that hazard or where you lie in those 3 risk factor areas. So the simplest is like things like don't allow wood roofs, let's stay with class A materials. Siding can be the same way, right? Class A, B, and C. So you're trying to keep the ignition level of these products down, right? Another way, if you were trying to get really stringent, would be give a wall a rating, right? So an example of that is we're in a rated room. These doors are probably 90 minutes, I would assume. But in an exterior wall, that would be as simple as potentially applying drywall to the outside of the wall before you apply maybe wood, plywood, and siding or whatever you apply. So what you're doing is trying to protect the structural integrity of your home. So if the siding catches on fire, maybe we have a 1 hour rating of the structure itself, the wood studs. Does that make sense? So that's another way you could go even a little more stringent with building codes. So, but I do understand these are all financial costs, right? That could increase the cost of what we already are seeing as record high numbers right now. So we want to be careful with what we do, work with the public, work with our elected officials, and make some decisions as we move forward. See, the great thing about adopting ICC codes is locally you can amend or delete or add sections, right? To tailor it to fit your community in the needs and the desires of everyone. So it's not that you have to adopt the whole book, but the book is there for us to utilize, right? And kind of amend, delete, or add to as we see fit to help our community up and fight these wildfires. So these 1 hour ratings, like keep in mind, not a fire official, but that's based on heat exposure or where that fire is with respect to that 1 hour wall. So it may hold up under certain conditions and save the structure, and other times it may not, right? It just depends on how extreme the fire is with heat. But currently I'm looking forward to our next code adoption, which is January 1st, 2024. We adopt on a 3-year cycle here in Routt County. And we try to stay 3 years behind the newest ICC code edition is our goal. And the reason I do that and recommend that is that it allows time for products to catch up to the newest code edition. And it allows time for design professionals, contractors, and ourselves as staff members in the building department to catch up on certification and training, right, to be prepared for it. And also outreach and education. So if we're 3 years behind, I can kind of look out there, we're not the guinea pigs, right? And that's that part of amending, deleting, or adding code sections. So let someone else find out what's not working with the new code, and we can work around that as we adopt it. But, that's all I have today. All right.
Thank you. We appreciate all three. Let's hear from that. So we appreciate the three who brought that back to community and really how we have this unique period of time through building codes and through our other plans, including the master plan, to bring that all home with the community for wildfire protection plans. We have limited time, but I do want to make sure if you have a burning question, of course, it would be the Board of Realtors president who would have a question probably about building a property. Ulrich, we'll turn it to you.
Imagine that. So I'm sorry, this is going to be a long question. I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. So, of course, like many communities, we have two silos, right? We are here today to help protect as many properties as we can. And you do it through regulation, and you do it through codes, and you do it through policies. Our other silo is one of affordable housing or attainable housing. And the two don't ever seem to mend or meld. Our contractors are telling us right now that any new build, you better, not including the cost of the land, but you better start at about $800 a square foot. Right away, that makes it unattainable for most, for what it would make it unattainable for me. I've been here for 45 years. So the challenge is how can you take those regulations, still protect the communities, and we want to keep communities. We want to keep the firefighters and the teachers, the police officers, and everybody to be able to live and recreate within a community so that we're not Vail or Disneyland. And so how can you meld those two?
That's an easy one.
Resources manager. I don't think there's any easy answer to that one, and I mean that is a key question, and I think we just have to look at what are the measures that are most effective for our risk types and our community, and where can we get the most bang for our buck.
Adding on to that, I mean, what incentives are in the pipeline for encouraging like insurance, taxes, and then how can we inform people who we go and talk to about defensible space around home sites of those potential incentives?
So, does it work? There we go. So insurance is supposed to be reviewing building code effectiveness, grading skills, right? And we participate in that in a 3-year basis usually. So the fire department will participate in that, the building department generally as well. So we just completed that last year. It's very time consuming. You get a rating from a 1 to 10, right? And they look at your community for your building codes and your fire codes specifically, but also we had adopted wildfire codes, right? So currently we're at grading scale 3. When I came here in 2017, we were at 9. Just to give you an idea, so we used to adopt codes on a 6-year basis, and we were 6 or 9 years behind the newest code as well. So that's one of the reasons we received a 9, right? So by stepping up the plate and adopting on a 3-year basis and staying more consistent, and then only 3 years behind, we got to a 3. I know the fire department is based a lot on response time, probably, right? How fast they can get to every property. That depends on each fire district, right? We're in a rural area here, but inside of the city, I don't know, I assume you guys are probably around 12 minutes or something, right?
So that number is over there, 3, that is in the city and within a 5-mile radius of a fire station and having a municipal watershed or an acceptable watershed.
Yeah.
All those things go into that. So you get outside of that and things change.
Exactly. So that's like one part of your question with insurance, and back to you with building materials, right? Like I can't control the cost of building materials at all. But yeah, we try to work with our contractors during these code adoptions and make tweaks, right? So example is the energy code. We want to be sustainable, right? And protect our climate, reduce energy, save it inside our buildings. So we tweaked the energy code locally. Last code adoption, I worked with the contractors and designers. As an example, exterior walls, as written on the code, were supposed to be R5 continuous on the outside with R20 and 10, right? That R5 was very expensive. It's called zip panel board. It's green. Everybody's seen it, right? It had 2 inches of foam on the outside. Even before inflation, when it first came out, it was $60 a sheet. It was probably up to 120, right, in the last year. But we tweaked that code and said, listen, it's about our value and keeping heat inside the home, not about products, right? So you gotta be careful because there can be lobbying and codes, right? So if you've ever been to a code hearing like I have, it's suppliers and the people that produce materials show up and wave their hand and vote. So we introduced 3 options for exterior walls, none of them which are a poor option, it's just a different way to build, to answer your question, right? So we allow R27 in a cavity, and they can go back to 7/16 OSB on the outside, right? So which was, before inflation, there was probably 15 or 20 issue. Of course, that's gone up too, but there's an example of working with the public. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.